The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Franklin Carter adjusted his glasses, glancing down at the case file in front of him. The tension in the air was heavy. Every person in the room knew that in just a few moments he would deliver his verdict. Michael Miller, the accused, sat motionless at the defense table, his hands clenched into fists. He had insisted on his innocence from the beginning, but things weren't looking good for him. On the other side of the courtroom, Prosecutor Richard Wallace stood with an air of certainty, ready to claim another victory. Just as the judge opened his mouth to speak, a voice broke through the silence. "Wait!" All eyes turned in shock. Standing at the back of the courtroom was Jordan Miller, just 11 years old, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "I have proof that my father is innocent." The room gasped. Even the judge's stern expression wavered. No one expected a child to speak up in court, but what Jordan was about to reveal would change everything. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe for more powerful stories. All heads in the courtroom turned toward the back, where Jordan Miller stood, his small frame shaking slightly, but his eyes burning with determination. Judge Franklin Carter, who had been seconds away from delivering his verdict, hesitated. His deep, commanding voice filled the courtroom. "Young man, do you realize where you are? This is a court of law, and interruptions are not taken lightly." His expression was firm, but there was curiosity in his eyes, curiosity about what could make a child this young disrupt such a serious proceeding. Jordan swallowed hard, but didn't back down. "I know, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. "But if you give me a chance to speak, I can prove my father didn't do what they're accusing him of." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Michael Miller, sitting at the defense table, looked at his son in shock, his hands tightening around the edge of the table. His lawyer leaned in and whispered, "Did you know he was going to do this?" But Michael shook his head. He hadn't. The courtroom was packed. Lawyers, reporters, members of the public, all watching in stunned silence. Prosecutor Richard Wallace frowned, clearly displeased by the sudden interruption. He had spent the entire trial building his case against Michael, convinced that justice was on his side. But now, a boy, a child, was standing in the middle of his perfectly constructed case, threatening to unravel everything. Wallace turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defense has already had their chance to present evidence." Judge Carter raised a hand, silencing the prosecutor. He had been on the bench for years, had seen countless cases, but something about this moment felt different. He studied Jordan, noting the boy's clenched fists, the way his chest rose and fell as he tried to steady his breath. This wasn't just a desperate outburst. This was something more. The judge adjusted his glasses. "You're telling me you have proof?" Jordan nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, I do. And if you just let me show you, you'll see that my dad is innocent." The judge tapped his fingers on the bench, deep in thought. The courtroom remained utterly still, waiting for his decision. Finally, he spoke. "Very well. If what you say is true, I will allow you to present your evidence. But understand this, young man. If this is a lie, you will be held accountable for disrupting court proceedings." Jordan took a deep breath and stepped forward. The entire courtroom watched as he approached the front, standing just a few feet away from the man who held his father's fate in his hands. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the proof he had carried with him. His heart pounded, but he knew this was his moment. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly. "Go ahead, son. Let's hear what you have to say." Jordan took a deep breath, his small hands gripping the voice recorder tightly. The weight of the entire courtroom seemed to press down on him, but he refused to back down. His father's freedom depended on this moment. He could feel everyone's eyes on him, some filled with doubt, others with curiosity. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, his deep voice cutting through the tense silence. "Young man, what is on that recorder?" he asked, his tone both firm and intrigued. Jordan raised the device, his voice steady, despite the pounding in his chest. "This has a conversation I heard the night my dad was arrested," he explained. "I was outside when I saw two men talking near our building. They didn't see me, but I heard what they said. I knew it was important, so I recorded it." The courtroom filled with whispers. Michael Miller, sitting at the defense table, looked at his son in disbelief, his heart racing. He had no idea Jordan had been carrying this secret. The prosecutor, Richard Wallace, let out a scoff, shaking his head in irritation. "Your Honor, this is absurd," he said dismissively. "We can't allow random recordings from a child to be used as evidence. There's no proof this is even real." But Judge Carter held up his hand, silencing the objection. He turned back to Jordan. "Play it," he instructed, his gaze serious. Jordan's fingers trembled slightly as he pressed the button. A small beep sounded, and then the courtroom was filled with the sound of a low, deep voice crackling through the speakers. The words that followed sent a wave of shock through the room. "You know this is wrong. He's innocent." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Michael's defense attorney sat up straighter, his expression suddenly alert. The recording continued, and the next voice sent a chill down everyone's spine. "Just do what you're told. No one needs to know the truth. If he takes the fall, it's better for everyone." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Jordan let the words hang in the air before stopping the recording. He lifted his head, his voice firm. "That first voice is Officer Trent Davidson. He was one of the officers who arrested my dad." Judge Carter's expression darkened as he turned to the defense attorney. "Is this voice recognizable?" he asked. The lawyer hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Yes, Your Honor. That is definitely Officer Davidson's voice." The prosecutor's face paled as he shot up from his seat. "Your Honor, this so-called evidence is highly questionable. A child recording something in secret? How do we even know it hasn't been tampered with?" His words came fast, desperate, his earlier confidence shaken. Judge Carter, however, remained unmoved. His sharp gaze settled on Wallace. "If the arresting officer himself is recorded expressing doubts about the case, then we have a serious issue at hand. I am ordering an immediate review of this evidence." Jordan exhaled in relief, his hands still shaking. He had done it. He had spoken up, and people were listening. His father's lawyer placed a reassuring hand on Michael's shoulder, whispering something too low for anyone else to hear. But Michael's eyes, for the first time in weeks, held hope. The courtroom had shifted. The case, which had once seemed hopeless, had been thrown into chaos by an 11-year-old boy who refused to stay silent. But it wasn't over yet. The truth had been exposed. But now, the battle for justice was only beginning. The courtroom remained frozen in silence, the weight of Jordan's revelation settling over everyone like a thick fog. Judge Carter's sharp gaze moved between the boy and the prosecutor, his mind already calculating the implications of what had just been revealed. The recording was more than just a child's plea. It was a direct contradiction to the prosecution's case. It was possible evidence of a wrongful arrest, and, more dangerously, a cover-up. Prosecutor Richard Wallace, who had spent the entire trial exuding confidence, was now visibly unsettled. He cleared his throat and straightened his suit, desperate to regain control of the room. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," he started, his voice sharper than before. "This recording was obtained by a minor, without proper authorization. There is no official verification of its authenticity. We can't just allow random, unverified evidence to derail the justice process." Judge Carter tapped his fingers on the bench, his face unreadable. He had been on the bench long enough to recognize when someone was stalling. Finally, he spoke. "Mr. Wallace, are you suggesting that we should ignore potential evidence simply because it was gathered unexpectedly?" He paused for effect, his tone heavy. "If this recording is real, it suggests a gross miscarriage of justice, and that is something this court will not ignore." Wallace clenched his jaw, but he knew he couldn't argue against the judge's reasoning. His only option was to discredit the evidence as much as possible. "Then I request an immediate forensic review of the recording," he said quickly. "Until we can determine if it is genuine, it should not be considered in this case." Jordan, who had stood silently as the adults debated his words, finally spoke up. "I know what I heard," he said, his voice steady. "And I know that's Officer Davidson's voice." He looked directly at Wallace, unshaken. "You don't want to believe me because I'm a kid. But what if I hadn't spoken up? Would you really let an innocent man go to prison just because you don't want to listen?" The prosecutor flinched slightly at the boy's words, but before he could respond, Michael's defense attorney stood. "Your Honor, given the serious nature of this evidence, I move to delay the verdict until a full review of the recording can be completed. If this recording is proven to be authentic, then this entire case needs to be re-examined." Judge Carter nodded slowly, absorbing the request. He glanced toward Michael, who had been sitting in tense silence, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The man had endured months of accusations, had been painted as a criminal despite pleading his innocence, and now his own son, just a child, had risked everything to expose the truth. After a long pause, the judge finally spoke. "I agree. This is too significant to ignore. I am ordering an immediate analysis of this recording. Court is adjourned until further notice." His gavel came down with a sharp bang, and just like that, the case was no longer as open and shut as Wallace had once believed. The tension in the room shifted. Reporters scribbled furiously. Lawyers whispered to one another, and Michael Miller, for the first time in months, exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned toward his son, his voice thick with emotion. "Jordan!" Jordan ran to his father, wrapping his small arms around him. "I told you I wouldn't let them take you," he whispered. Michael held him tightly, his eyes closing for just a moment, silently thanking the son who had just changed everything. Michael held Jordan tightly as the weight of the moment settled over him. His son had just done something extraordinary, something that no one had expected. As the courtroom slowly emptied after Judge Carter's adjournment, Michael looked down at Jordan, his eyes filled with gratitude and disbelief. "You didn't have to do that, son," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Jordan pulled back slightly, shaking his head with determination. "Yes, I did. You always told me to stand up for what's right. I couldn't let them send you away when I knew the truth." His small hands balled into fists as he spoke, showing a kind of strength that seemed far beyond his years. Meanwhile, Prosecutor Wallace remained at his table, his hands gripping the edges, as he stared blankly at the emptying room. The case he had been so certain of was now unraveling before his eyes. He had built his argument on the assumption that Michael Miller was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But that recording, if proven authentic, would destroy everything. His mind raced, searching for a way to regain control of the situation. He turned to his assistant, his voice low but urgent. "Get me everything on Officer Davidson," he ordered through gritted teeth. "If this kid's recording is real, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with." His assistant nodded quickly and rushed out of the courtroom. Over the next few days, the legal system moved faster than anyone had anticipated. The forensic analysis of Jordan's recording had been prioritized, and when the results came back, they sent shockwaves through the entire case. The voices on the tape had been confirmed as Officer Trent Davidson and another unidentified man, discussing Michael's arrest and strongly implying a setup. The revelation sent the prosecution scrambling. If a police officer had deliberately withheld information or fabricated evidence, then the entire case was compromised. When court reconvened, the atmosphere was different. The once assured prosecutor now carried the weight of a case falling apart in his hands. The public had caught wind of the new developments, and reporters filled the courtroom, eager to hear how the legal system would respond. Michael sat at the defense table once again, but this time hope shone in his eyes. His lawyer patted his shoulder reassuringly. Across the aisle, Wallace's team shuffled uncomfortably, already sensing the inevitable. Judge Carter entered and took his seat, his face unreadable as he reviewed the final forensic report. The tension in the room was thick, every person holding their breath as they waited for him to speak. Finally, he looked up, his deep voice filling the courtroom. "This court has received verifiable proof that key information regarding this case was hidden. This is a serious matter, and it raises grave concerns about the integrity of the arrest and the prosecution's case." He turned toward Wallace, his sharp gaze unwavering. "Mr. Wallace, do you have anything to say regarding these findings?" Wallace hesitated, adjusting his tie as he cleared his throat. He had no solid argument left. "Your Honor, we acknowledge the new evidence. Given this development, we no longer have confidence in the original charges." His words were slow, reluctant. The prosecutor, who had once been eager to secure a conviction, was now being forced to admit defeat. Judge Carter nodded, satisfied. "In light of this evidence, the court finds that there is no legal justification to continue pursuing charges against Michael Miller." He paused, his voice firm. This case should have never gone this far. Justice is not about securing convictions. It is about uncovering the truth. And in this case, a young boy had to bring that truth to light. He picked up his gavel. "The charges against Mr. Miller are hereby dismissed." The gavel came down with a sharp bang, and the room erupted. A collective gasp filled the air, followed by murmurs and shouts from the crowd. Reporters rushed to jot down notes, some even whispering into their microphones, reporting the news in real time. Michael sat frozen for a moment, his brain struggling to process what had just happened. Then, as the reality of his freedom sank in, he turned to his son. Jordan was already smiling, his eyes welling with tears. "Dad, you're free!" he cried, his voice trembling with joy. Without hesitation, Michael pulled his son into his arms, hugging him tighter than ever before. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the relief wash over him. "I never thought I'd see this day," he whispered, his voice breaking. Across the courtroom, Wallace sat stiffly, his face pale. His confidence was gone, replaced by the harsh realization that he had almost sent an innocent man to prison. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, and for the first time, he understood the danger of pursuing convictions over justice. He glanced toward Judge Carter, who was still watching him, his expression unreadable. Wallace knew this case would follow him for the rest of his career. Michael slowly pulled away from Jordan and looked him in the eyes. "You saved me," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You stood up in front of all these people and told the truth when no one else would." Jordan sniffed and wiped his eyes. "I just did what you always taught me, Dad." The judge tapped his gavel one final time, calling for order as the crowd erupted in conversations. Before officially dismissing the court, he turned his gaze to Jordan. "Young man, this court owes you a debt of gratitude," he said. "Your courage to speak up made the difference between injustice and freedom. Remember this: you are never too small to change the course of the truth." As Michael and Jordan walked out of the courthouse together, the fresh air felt different, lighter, full of possibilities. The weight that had been pressing down on their family had finally lifted. People shook Michael's hand, patted Jordan on the back, and even the defense attorney looked genuinely moved. For the first time in months, Michael could breathe without fear. But more than anything, he knew one thing for certain. His son wasn't just a boy. He was a hero. As Michael and Jordan stepped out of the courthouse, the crisp air filled their lungs, feeling fresher than it had in months. The weight that had pressed so heavily on their shoulders was finally gone. For the first time in what felt like forever, Michael could walk freely without the shadow of a prison sentence looming over him. But more than his own relief, he was overwhelmed with pride for his son. Jordan had stood up in a courtroom full of adults, unshaken by the pressure, and had changed the course of justice with nothing but the truth. Michael squeezed his son's shoulder and looked down at him with admiration. "You were incredible in there," he said. Jordan smiled, though his eyes still held the emotion of everything that had just happened. "I just did what I had to do, Dad. I couldn't let them take you away." As they walked down the courthouse steps, people approached them one by one. Strangers who had watched the trial unfold, reporters who had been following the case, even some of the court officers. Many of them had assumed Michael was guilty when the trial first began, but now they looked at him differently. "Your son is a hero," one man said, shaking Michael's hand. "I've never seen anything like that in a courtroom." Another woman, an elderly lady with tears in her eyes, touched Jordan's shoulder gently. "You remind me of my grandson. The world needs more young men like you." Jordan blushed, but stood tall, accepting their words with quiet humility. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Prosecutor Wallace sat in his office, his hands steepled under his chin. The weight of what had just transpired sank in deeper with each passing second. He had pursued this case with unwavering determination, certain that he was serving justice. But the truth, the real truth, had slipped through his fingers because he had been too focused on winning rather than finding what was right. He thought back to the moment Jordan played that recording, the way the entire courtroom had shifted in an instant. A child had succeeded where an entire legal team had failed. Wallace had built his career on strong cases and confident arguments, but today he had been forced to face something he hadn't before: humility. He exhaled slowly, knowing that this case would haunt him for a long time. Outside, Michael and Jordan reached their car, but before getting in, Michael stopped and turned to his son. He crouched slightly, looking him in the eyes. "Jordan," he said, his voice softer now, "you didn't just save me today. You reminded everyone in that courtroom what justice is supposed to mean." Jordan's eyes glistened and he bit his lip. He had been so focused on proving his father's innocence that he hadn't really thought about the bigger picture. But now, standing here, he realized something. This wasn't just about his dad. This was about standing up against injustice, about making sure the truth wasn't buried. Judge Carter, who had just exited the courthouse himself, overheard Michael's words and approached them. "Mr. Miller," he said, nodding respectfully, "and Jordan." The judge's usual stern demeanor had softened slightly as he looked at the young boy before him. It takes great courage to stand up in a courtroom, especially at your age. Many adults would have stayed silent, even when they knew something was wrong. But you spoke up, and because of that, justice was served today. He paused, then added, "Never forget the power of your voice. It's stronger than you know." Jordan's chest swelled with pride, but he simply nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said respectfully. The judge gave him a small, approving smile before walking away, leaving Michael and Jordan to absorb everything that had just happened. As they finally got into the car, Jordan turned to his father. "What happens now?" he asked. Michael exhaled, gripping the steering wheel for a moment before looking at his son. "Now," he repeated, a small smile forming. "Now, we go home, and we start living again." For months, they had been stuck in survival mode, unable to think about anything beyond the trial, beyond the fear of what could happen. But now, the future stretched out before them, full of possibilities. As Michael started the car, he glanced at his son once more. "And, Jordan," he added, "no matter what happens next, I want you to remember today. Remember that you have the power to change things. And never let anyone take that from you." Jordan smiled, gripping his seatbelt. "I won't, Dad," he promised. And as they drove away from the courthouse, away from the nightmare that had almost stolen everything from them, both father and son knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. As Michael and Jordan drove away from the courthouse, a peaceful silence filled the car. The nightmare that had once threatened to tear them apart was over, replaced by a newfound sense of freedom. Michael glanced over at his son, who stared out of the window, deep in thought. He knew that today would be a moment Jordan would never forget. The world had seen him as just a child, but today he had proved that even the smallest voices can make the biggest impact. Back in the courthouse, Judge Carter sat in his chambers, reflecting on the trial. He had seen countless cases, but this one stood out. A young boy had challenged a system that often overlooked the powerless, reminding everyone that justice isn't about power. It's about truth. Across town, Prosecutor Wallace sat at his desk, staring at the file he had once been so confident in. He had been taught a lesson he would never forget. Justice was not about winning, but about doing what was right. Some people believe that one voice can't make a difference, but Jordan Miller proved them all wrong. He stood up when it mattered most, and because of that, an innocent man walked free. What do you think? Should more young people be encouraged to speak out when they see injustice? Let us know in the comments. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. The truth will always find a way, but sometimes it needs someone brave enough to speak it. See you in the next one.